Remember when God warns Noah of a coming flood? What's the deal with the great deep bursting open and the windows of heaven opening up? What's the significance of God sealing Noah and his family into the ark? And why does the flood story sound very similar to a parable Jesus gave centuries later? Let's dive into Genesis chapter 7, verse 9 through 16 and find out. We'll start in verse 8. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean and of birds, everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. A few things to note is this: the 7 days, the waters, and the earth. Okay, let's get started. 2 words to capture this entire chapter would be either preservation and destruction or taken and left. Taken and left. To summarize this chapter, Noah finishes the ark, and 7 days before the flood, God tells Noah to bring his family and the animals into the ark. God brings the flood waters onto the land to destroy all life, and the waters prevail for 150 days. You can watch the first episode in this Genesis 7 series for the key words, key ideas, and the chapter breakdown. For now, we're going to jump right in. Verse 9, this is the 3rd time that we see this statement. God commanding Noah, and then Noah doing everything that, don't know where that came from. Noah doing everything that God commanded. We've seen that right here in verse 5. Noah did all the Lord had commanded him. We've seen that at the end of chapter 6. Verse 22, Noah did all that God commanded. So this is the 3rd time. There's something about that statement that is incredibly important for what is going on. Noah built the ark the 1st time. He obeyed God. Noah went into the ark the 2nd time. Even down to the details of bringing in the right amount of each specific kind of animal, clean versus unclean birds, all that stuff. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. The flood waters came exactly when God said they would, which was after Noah had done all that God had told him to do. In other words, God accounted for when Noah would do. Noah listened, Noah obeyed, and then the flood waters come. Part of God's timing actually involved Noah's obedience. And I think that speaks to just something about God and how he works in the earth. Also, the fact that the floodwaters came right here after 7 days. Lost my place in my note. The fact the floodwaters came after 7 days doesn't mean that 7 days passed since Noah went into the ark. And again, I read this story as Noah went into the ark actually on the 7th day. And I get that from verse, where is it? It'll say the exact day. And rain fell on verse 13, right here. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, they go into the ark. Same day of what? Same day of the flood. So I am working from the idea. I know other people would read this as Noah went in 7 days before the flood when God told him to. God didn't tell him when to go in. He just said to go in. There was no time frame attached to that. So Noah obeys either way, whether it was the day of the flood or 7 days before. And I read it as, hey, 7 days before the flood. We have that waiting period. Noah goes in the day of the flood. And the fact that the floodwaters came after the 7 days doesn't mean that Noah has gone into the ark and 7 days have passed. Rather, the point of reference is not Noah going into the ark, but the point of reference is that God told Noah to go into the ark before the floodwaters came in 7 days. After 7 days, the floodwaters came upon the earth. Noah and his family could have gone into the ark anytime before the floodwaters came. And here's what I want to connect this to. Matthew chapter 7, Jesus gives one of the most famous parables, being the parable of the wise man building his house on the rock. We know the songs about it. And then the foolish man building his house on the sand. Here's what I want to say about that. Matthew 7 speaks of 2 men that build 2 houses on 2 foundations. Both houses go through a flood and experience the floodwaters, but only one stands because that person obeyed the words of Jesus. That person did what God said, which was to trust in Christ for salvation, and he built his life on the rock of Jesus. And that parable is almost a mirror image of what's happening in this story. Here's what I mean. 2 groups of people here are doing something. You have Noah and his family going into the ark, and then everyone else is outside the ark in disobedience, rebellion, presumed wickedness, and just nothing but bloodshed and violence. So you have two groups, two categories of humanity right here in this story. Those who are in the ark and those who are not. Those who are swept away by the floodwaters and those who are not. And they stand strong and they're protected in the ark. One of these groups of people, that being Noah and his family, they build what God said to build and they listened to God's words. The others did not. God told Noah build the ark. He literally built this ark to find refuge in when the floodwaters came. He literally built something in response to God's command and in obedience. One builds on a strong foundation, Noah and his family, and the others do not, and they're swept away. Both experience the flood, but only one is safely brought through, standing on faith. It seems as though what Noah builds here, the floodwaters coming 7 days after God said they would, coming upon the earth. If you go back to Genesis chapter 6, you're going to see that what has essentially expanded across the land is nothing but bloodshed and violence, which seems to have originated in Cain, his line, and his city, which he names after Enoch, Cain's son, okay? So what you see is Cain built a city that was built on bloodshed and violence, and it was filled with wickedness and rebellion. And in contrast, here, Noah builds an ark, which is built in faith and obedience and trust. And it preserves life and it keeps life rather than taking life and bringing death. And I just see that strong contrast between not just the two men in Jesus' parable, but as Jesus' parable speaking to almost like these two categories of humanity. You have the wicked line of Cain building their own city on bloodshed and violence to bring death and destruction. And then you have Noah building an ark in faithfulness and obedience to God. And only one stands through the floodwaters. Verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, that is so many times longer than most of us will live. In the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day. What day? 600th year. Not specific enough. Okay, 2nd month. Not specific enough. 17th day of the month. Not specific enough. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth. In other words, the floodwaters came. The windows of the heavens were open. What's the deal with these windows and then the great deep? What's interesting about these two statements, these ideas, is we see these statements about the great deep and the windows of heaven. We see these statements linking us back to Genesis chapter 1. So in Genesis 1, the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the deep, and then God places an expanse between the waters to separate the waters above from the waters below, that being the heavens. Now, instead of God creating and structuring and ordering the world, God actually allows creation to implode and descend into disorder and chaos. In other words, what you're seeing here is not creation and things being built up and ordered and structured. You're seeing anti-creation that results from sin and wickedness. It's as if in Genesis 1, God's hands are shaping the formless world like clay. And now, with the floodwaters coming from both the heavens and the great deep, now it's as if God has taken his hands off for good and favor, and he's sovereignly allowing the world to actually cave in on itself to start over. What God has held together and even held back seems to be what he releases now. He's releasing what was kept back by the windows, by the the heavens and that keeping the waters above from the waters below. He's releasing the waters from beneath, so that again the land seems to descend into a state of disorder and chaos, which is what we see as the starting point in Genesis chapter 1, and God works from there. And then another question I have is, why do we know down to the exact day, month, and year, why are we given the exact day when the flood came? And also, why is Noah's age the reference point for the flood? Why measure the time of the flood based off Noah's life and how old he is? Just something to think about. Also, why does reverse creation happen in the 600th year? 600 being a multiple of 6, the number of man. How does the number 6 connect this story? Or rather, how does the number 6 itself connect to disorder and destruction and death, specifically taking place in this 600th year of Noah's life. Also, this is the second time Noah's age is referenced alongside the floodwaters coming. So we see the first time in Genesis chapter 5, Noah's 500 when he has his kids. And then in Genesis 6, or rather, is it Genesis 6? Verse 6 of chapter 7, I wrote down. Right here. Same chapter. I misread my notes. Noah's 600 when the flood of the waters came upon the earth, and we have more detail here. Not just 600, second month, 17th day. This is the second time Noah's age is referenced in connection to the floodwaters coming. It's just something to note. Also, we're told that God was going to bring the rain and the floodwaters, right? But here in verse 11, the text says, the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heaven were opened. And there's no explicit statement about God, and I just want to think about this. God has said, I will bring rain, I will bring the floodwaters, God is going to do stuff. And then when it actually comes down to it, and it all goes down, it just says, the great deep burst forth. The windows of the heavens were opened. And what I'm trying to say about that is we can for sure know that God is sovereignly over all things. Okay? But right here specifically, even though God said, I'll bring the floodwaters, I'll bring the rain, there's no explicit statement about God or anyone directly acting upon the great deep or the windows. There's no explicit statement about God directly doing something here. We can assume God is sovereignly over it and allowing this to happen to remain consistent with what he said, that he'd bring the floodwaters, but there might be a reason that it's stated in this kind of way. As if to say creation is kind of left on its own. God is over it. God said it would happen. He's in control. He's sovereign. But the way it's communicated, it's as if creation is just left to its own devices, and without the guiding, favorable hand of God on it, it just descends into nothing but disorder and chaos. So again, there's a reason I think the author states it this way, as if to say without God's hand of favor, creation just descends into nothingness. And then we go, okay, what can we conclude? Well, we can ask, how might this kind of understanding reveal what's happening deeper in the story? At least we can take away that God sovereignly acts as the creator and sustainer of all things. And if his hand of favor and grace is removed from anything, it can't flourish, and it will inevitably fall apart without his sovereign hand of approval over it. In other words, nothing can last or be sustained without God saying that it will. Real quick, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you at AboveReproachMinistry.com. Go to the website or click the links in the description below to check out all of our free Bible study resources. We have online Bible classes, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, all of my sermon notes, and more. You can even join our online church community on the Discord app. We also have discussion groups all around the world, and if you don't see one in your area, message me and we'll help you start a launch group. I personally lead a group in Spartanburg, South Carolina. If you live in the area, we'd love to have you join us on Fridays for Bible study. So contact me if you're interested, and if you or your church would like me to come preach or teach, just message me or shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do, because I love preaching in person. If you're a new follower of Jesus, click the New Believers section to access everything we recommend for new believers. And be sure to snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, to support this ministry. All right, that's all I got for you. Let's jump back into the video. And then verse 12, the rain fell upon the earth 40 days, another reference to how long the rain is going to come upon the land. On the very same day, what day? What day are we talking about? Well, the only other day that's referenced is on that day, the flood happens. So on that day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and Noah's wife and 3 wives of his sons with them, what do? On that day that the floodwaters come, they enter the ark, which would be the 7th day. So this is why I'm convinced that Noah did not go into the ark 7 days prior to the flood coming, but on the actual day of the flood. And that 7-day period was a time of preparation, somewhat consecration as well. But I would say, even if we go back to verse 1 and we say, well, God told Noah to go into the ark, he didn't say or specify when. Seems like he's going in the day the flood starts, and all stuff breaks loose. Also, the names of Noah's sons here are stated. Shem, Ham, Japheth. Who cares? I care. Because we haven't seen their names since chapter 5, verse 32. his sons have been referenced several times, and the text has no problem saying their names. But every other time, since chapter 5, verse 32, his sons have not been clearly named and identified personally. So I wonder, why are their names mentioned here when elsewhere they're just Noah's sons? And we know who they are, we know their names because they're chapter 5, but why here are they specifically named? For me, that's an interesting detail and something to note. Noah and his, Noah and his sons' names are mentioned. I will go here, actually. But we're never actually given the name of Noah's wife. It just says, Noah's wife. The Bible is so anti-women. No. Don't go there. Don't be weird. Just because their names are left out doesn't mean they're less valuable. There's something about the story that is emphasizing Noah and his sons, and it's not like the women don't matter, but they kind of fade into the background when it comes to the main point of what is being stated in this chapter. So I go, why don't we see their names? Why is their identity mysterious? Why is their heritage mysterious? What does their lack of detail highlight about this story and what's happening in this moment? The fact that certain details are left out, their heritage, where they come from, what their names are, instead of running with that a weird direction, I can go, hey, what does that tell me about what I should be thinking about this story in this moment? Verse 14, not only did they go into the ark with Noah, but they and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind. So if you watch the second video in this Genesis 7 series, I said, hey, in verse 8, the animals that go in with Noah are the creeping things. I'll just take you to verse 8. With my weird stain, clean animals, birds, not clean animals, and then everything that creeps on the ground. That's what goes into the ark with Noah. Okay? So, right here, we have some different categories. I just want you to note that. I'm not saying anything about it. I'm just saying for some reason we have more detail or different categories being worked with here. We have the livestock and creeping things. So we can't say, well, creeping thing captures all land creatures. No, because we have livestock. We have birds. We even have winged creatures. And then in verse 14, right before we get to this part, we have the beasts. So guess what? We have the beasts. We have the livestock. We have the creeping things. We have the birds. We have the winged creatures. Why didn't verse 8 work with those same categories? We were already told in verse 8 and 9 the animals went into the ark, and now for some reason that same detail is repeated here. That they all go into the ark with Noah. It's like, well, we already know that, so can we move on? Apparently, that detail is very important, that they go with Noah. And we already know that happened. Why repeat it again? What's being emphasized here is my question. And also, are winged creatures variations of birds? Are they kinds of bugs? What are these winged creatures? You might get an answer by reading the rest of the Bible. Off the top of my head, I ain't got nothing. But we see the distinction once again between creeping things, livestock, and beasts. And all I'm saying is, in verse 8, they're just referred to as clean, unclean animals, and then birds and creeping things. And I just go, why? Why? They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. I would like to know why this is mentioned. Obviously, if they're living creatures, they have the breath of life. So if this seems like an unnecessary detail, that it's like, well, that's assumed, we should lean into that and go, well, why is that being stated here clearly? The brief mention of these creatures having the breath of life is significant to me. We haven't seen this mentioned since chapter 6, verse 17. So go back a chapter, read verse 17. That's the last time we see God talking about the creatures that have the breath of life. And in that chapter, it's talking about God removing creatures that have the breath of life on the earth. Now, let me just verify that I ain't off the walls crazy. Just scanning. Scan. Everything. Okay, cool. I am correct. The last time we see the breath of life mentioned is in chapter 6, verse 17. And there, it's God talking about removing the breath of life, creatures on the land. And here, it's actually talking about those that are preserved. And the only other reference to the breath of life, can you guess where we see that? I'll give you 5 seconds. Chapter 2 of Genesis, when God breathes the breath of life into man's nostrils, and in chapter 1, where the animals have the breath of life from God. So this statement not only mentions the severity of what's taking place, like God really removed life from the land, but it's actually linking us back to the original creation story to say that things are no longer good the way they were intended to be. The condition of the world and life, it's not good as it is. And God needs to bring creation back to the ideal, even if it's not exactly in the Garden of Eden and good like that, like the good old days. There needs to be a kind of a reset back to the original intent and the purpose of creation. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, which was, did we see that already? Yeah, all flesh right here. I'm just going to highlight that because I didn't notice that twice. The emphasis of it being all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. And the Lord shut him in. So let's end here. This is the 4th time we see the idea of Noah doing all that God commanded him. Now this, it doesn't exactly say Noah did all that God commanded him, but the fact that he brings the animals, the male and female in the flesh, it's in obedience to God's command. This is the 4th time we see that idea. And each time Noah obeys God's command, we see God respond to Noah's obedience by doing what Noah could not do. So it's as if Noah does what he can, and God will do what he cannot. And in chapter 6, verse 22, go read it, Noah built the ark. God responds by telling Noah in chapter 7 when the flood is coming and what to do next. And then when Noah took the 7 pairs of clean animals with the 7 pairs of birds and went into the ark, we see God bring the floodwaters that day. And then here we see God shut Noah in and his family into the ark. So there's this partnership. There's this God responds, God waits, God is patient, God lets humanity respond in obedience and faithfulness. Then God does his part. There's a co-laboring going on that God does not have to involve humanity in, but it's beautiful. Also, what does it mean for God to shut Noah in? That's some aggressive language. Did God close the door because it was too heavy? It was too large? Did God lock it up tight and kind of seal him in? Was there an extra level of security because God's hand was on it? It does bring me to the idea of us in John chapter 6. Jesus talks about how we are secure in his hands. No one can remove us from his Father's hands. His Father is stronger than anyone. No one can get out of his hands. No one can take us from his hands. It's that, hey, he's got you. It's a good thing to be got by God and safe and secure. So my question is, was this just a statement about God ensuring Noah's safety with his family and the animals? Because it's interesting to note that Noah is never actually said to be closing the door behind him. Now you can assume he did. You can assume, well, he needed help. It was too big. But we only see Noah going into the ark. That's it. And then God shuts him in, which could be God shutting the door in, which actually, for me, sounds similar to Jesus being placed in the tomb and sealed up with the stone. But instead of God speaking, instead of God sparing his son from experiencing death, God actually allows his son to be temporarily shut up behind the tomb in the grave, only to break out in victory and, of course, roll away the stone. And I think the same way we'll see Noah come out of the ark with his family into a kind of new life, which the resurrection points to, or rather that moment in Noah's story points to the resurrection. But in this case, Noah is shutting Noah in to spare him from death, whereas God actually purposely allowed his son to be shut up into the grave in the tomb so that he could resurrect and break forth from that. In other words, one is sparing from death, the other is bringing life through allowing his chosen one to go into death, that being Jesus. So I just see the idea of Jesus being shut in the tomb. Maybe that's a weird correlation, but for me, that's just where I go, because there's so much of this story that screams salvation and redemption in Christ through faith. And so it would make sense that the way that God shuts him in is this extra level of security and safety, but also the way that Jesus was sealed up was supposed to keep his followers from breaking him out. And it's as if God does the opposite. He allows him to be shut in, but he intends to break him out. whereas here he shuts Noah in to spare him from death. Maybe a weird correlation. That's just where my mind goes. And then here's the last thing I want to say. And there are probably other stories, like Daniel being sealed up in the tomb, the lion's den, Joseph being put in the prison or in the pit. He's sort of sealed up in both. But God's hand is over all of those scenarios to bring life through that. Last thing to say, 3 times we're told Noah and his family with the animals went into the ark. Noah, his family, with the animals went into the ark. Verse 7, verse 13, and now here in verse 15 and 16. Then in verse 11 and 15, the animals went into the ark. And there are many references to God's remnant going into the ark, instead of it just being a one-time event to move on from. It's constantly being brought up. I want you to note that in verse 7, 13, here, 11, 15, there's this repeating idea of going into the ark. It's not just like, when it happens, we'll talk about it, and then we'll never talk about it again. There's so many times throughout this chapter, the idea of going into the ark is mentioned. And I think there's significance within that for this story. At least that is a main component to what's going on. Noah, animals, family going into the ark. And though it does happen one time, it's stated many times. And I think as good Bible students, we're to pay attention to how frequently that repeats and then go, what am I supposed to know about that as it relates to this story? What am I supposed to conclude? What is it that God is showing us through that? We will pick it up in verse 17 in the next Bible study walkthrough. Until then, let me know your thoughts, questions, comments, everything, whatever, as long as you're respectful and kind. Share that in the comments below. I love hearing what God is teaching you and what you take away from these, to know that they're actually helping, teaching you how to read the Bible with a different, different perspective and in a different way than maybe you're used to. But that's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts and your insights in the comments. If you want to share your thoughts and questions about these studies, join us every Thursday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a live discussion together. And thank you for supporting this ministry. Your support helps us accomplish our mission, which is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. We're only able to make all of these free resources because of generous supporters like you. So thank you very much for all of your support. Make sure to visit AboveReproachMinistry.com to check out all of our free resources. And as always, keep moving towards Jesus.